This is the story of the most cursed ship ever to touch the sea. Envisioned as the largest paddle steamer ever constructed, this vessel was meant to be a floating palace, luxurious enough to carry over 4,000 passengers across the globe without a single stop for coal or supplies. It could travel all the way from London to the newly established colony of Sydney, Australia, in one uninterrupted voyage. A marvel of ambition and engineering, it was hailed as the Crystal Palace of the Sea. But in truth, it was a mechanical nightmare. A cursed colossus that would bankrupt its creators, kill its designer, destroy a dozen ships, incite riots, and leave a trail of financial and human wreckage in its wake. This is the tale of a visionary's obsession turned deadly. The doomed journey of the SS Great Eastern. The mind behind this ill-fated behemoth was none other than Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a genius of steam and steel. He had already changed the world with the Great Western and the Great Britain, two transatlantic steamships that redefined sea travel. But Brunel wasn't content with merely linking Europe and America. His eyes turned toward the East, Asia, Australia, Africa. Why settle for the Atlantic when he could conquer oceans? In a burst of industrial ambition, he designed a ship unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would carry 4,000 passengers, 500 crew, 15,000 tons of coal, and 13,000 tons of cargo, all at once. It was 6 times larger than any ship afloat. Faster, stronger, unstoppable. It would monopolize global trade. It would make Britain the absolute master of the sea. And it would do it all with unprecedented luxury. But creating a leviathan of this size required more than dreams. It needed innovation. Brunel combined 3 propulsion systems: a single screw propeller, massive paddle wheels, and even sails. He aimed for a top speed of 14 knots, about 16 miles per hour. That was unheard of for a ship so massive. But there was a reason it hadn't been done. It was nearly impossible. Twin screws were still experimental, and he doubted that a single shaft, whether paddle or propeller, could handle the brute force needed to move a 20,000-ton hull. So he went hybrid. He went bold. And that boldness would cost him everything. In 1851, the Eastern Steam Navigation Company, or ESN Company, was formed to tap into the booming Australian trade fueled by the gold rush. Though they lost the government mail contract, they still had capital. And Brunel had a dream. And so, the nightmare began. In 1854, construction started in Millwall on the River Thames. Brunel partnered with famed engineer John Scott Russell. Russell had worked with Brunel before, but this time, he underbid the project at £377,000, far below even Brunel's own estimate. That was red flag number 1. And then came red flag number 2. There was no dry dock in England large enough to accommodate the behemoth. So, they built it sideways on a massive timber slipway, an untested gamble. One mistake, and the entire ship could collapse under its own weight. The hull alone required over 30,000 iron plates, secured by more than 3 million hand-driven rivets. Custom rolling and punching machines had to be invented just to fabricate the parts. The ship featured a double hull, a safety innovation a century ahead of its time. But everything about the ship was heavy, slow, expensive. The crankshaft, needed to transfer engine power to the paddles, had to be cast 3 times before it didn't break under its own weight. The 5 smokestacks towered over the vessel, connected to 10 boilers and 4 massive steam engines. The sails? Pointless. The smoke from the stacks ignited them. They were abandoned before ever being used. Russell, meanwhile, was drowning in debt. Instead of focusing on the Great Eastern, he took on contracts for 5 other ships, redirecting workers and resources away from Brunel's masterpiece. By 1856, he was asking for emergency funds just to pay wages, many for men who weren't even working on the ship. Brunel and the ESN Company had seen enough. They seized the shipyard, kicked Russell out, and tried to salvage the project. But the damage had been done. Launch day. Thousands gathered. The press was watching. Foreign dignitaries looked on in awe. But when they tried to slide the 12,000-ton hull into the Thames, it didn't budge. The rails buckled. Steel twisted. 2 men were crushed to death on the spot. That made 7 fatalities before the ship even touched water. Critics dubbed it Brunel's folly. The newspapers called it the Great Failure. It took months of rescheduling, chains, jacks, and hydraulic rams, borrowed from every corner of southeast England. The cost? Astronomical. One engineer made enough to launch his own company just from the rental fees of his equipment. But finally, in early 1858, with a horrifying creak of metal and a groan like thunder, the Great Eastern slid into the Thames. She was afloat, but the company wasn't. The project had cost upwards of £700,000, almost double Russell's original estimate. And it still wasn't finished. The ship needed interior fittings, rigging, and machinery. But the money was gone. The company was effectively bankrupt. In a desperate move, the Eastern Steam Navigation Company was liquidated. The Great Eastern was sold at a massive loss to a new entity, the Great Ship Company. Their price? £160,000. A fraction of the original investment. The original investors? Ruined. Brunel would not live to see his creation sail. The stress, the setbacks, and the financial chaos weighed heavily on him. In 1859, before the Great Eastern's maiden voyage, he collapsed and died from a stroke at age 53. The ship he gave everything for had already taken too much. But the tragic voyage of the SS Great Eastern was only beginning. The colossal dream that was the Great Eastern had already devoured its creators in a tidal wave of debt before it had even touched open water. Now, with the original company sinking fast, a new set of investors had seized control. Their first order of business? Find someone, anyone, who could actually finish the job. They began soliciting tenders to complete the ship's interior, install its mechanical systems, and deliver the luxurious finishing touches that had once only existed on paper. Ironically, and perhaps inevitably, one of the bids came from a familiar name, John Scott Russell, the same man who had earlier failed so spectacularly during the initial construction. With Brunel temporarily out of the picture due to health issues brought on by the immense stress of the ship's launch, the board approved Russell's surprisingly low offer, £125,000 to complete the fitting out of the vessel. When Brunel returned in January 1859, he was shocked to learn that his once-dismissed partner was back in charge. Still, time was short. Russell agreed to have the ship ready for sea within 6 months. And by the summer of 1859, the Great Eastern was finally nearing completion. Inside the vast iron hull, workers installed lavish passenger accommodations that rivaled the finest hotels. The 5 grand salons were so extravagant that contemporary journalists remarked each one felt like an entire resort simply dropped into the ship. But grandeur came with a cost. The budget ballooned. To cut losses, the original plan to sail the ship to Australia was scrapped, replaced by a more modest goal: voyages between England and America. But then, disaster struck. In September of 1859, the Great Eastern set out for sea trials. As it sailed down the Thames and toward the English Channel, a crowd of curious onlookers gathered to witness the spectacle. Off the coast of Hastings, the unthinkable happened. A massive explosion shook the ship. A steam valve, left closed after a pressure test, caused one of the boilers to rupture violently. 5 crewmen were killed instantly. The ship's forward funnel was destroyed, reducing its iconic 5 smokestack silhouette down to 4. The death toll climbed to 10. Just days before this tragedy, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the visionary behind the ship, had suffered a stroke after finally witnessing his masterpiece in motion. He died on September 15, 1859, never seeing his creation reach its full potential. The final casualty count rose to 11. The ship was repaired, but the damage, both physical and symbolic, was immense. Still, the owners pressed on. In 1860, the Great Eastern made her first Atlantic crossing under the flag of the newly formed Great Ship Company. Technically, it was a success. The ship handled the rough Atlantic waters with ease. But commercially, it was a financial nightmare. The sheer size of the vessel made it prohibitively expensive to operate, especially for the transatlantic route. With revenues lagging and maintenance costs soaring, the company slid deeper into debt. Desperate, the second board of directors resigned. A third group of stockholders now took the helm, 3 boards of leadership in under 10 years. This new team was determined to claw back some profits. Their idea? Turn the ship into a floating spectacle, a wonder of the modern world. They pitched the ship to major North American cities, igniting a bidding war. Even Portland, Maine, constructed a 125,000-pound pier in hopes of landing the giant vessel. But it was New York City that ultimately won, dredging a special berth just to accommodate her massive frame. It was a big win, at least in theory. In June 1860, the Great Eastern embarked on her grand North American debut. On board were just 35 passengers and a crew of over 400. As she arrived in New York Harbor, massive crowds gathered along the shoreline. But excitement quickly turned to anger. Visitors were expecting to pay the usual 25 cents to tour the ship. Instead, the owners charged a full $1, a steep sum in those days. The public was furious. To salvage the tour, the ship was sent on a short voyage to Virginia, hoping to attract more passengers. But instead, it revealed the ship's deep logistical flaws. The problems were endless: spoiled food, broken sanitation systems, confused bookings, and overlapping cabin assignments. Families were randomly separated and housed with strangers. Even worse, undercover police assigned to catch pickpockets were discovered by angry passengers, who then locked them in the livestock pens for the entire journey in an impromptu riot. The so-called American tour was an absolute financial catastrophe. While the investors had projected over £700,000 in revenue, the ship brought in just £120,000, barely enough to cover £72,000 in expenses. Their response? Abandon America altogether. The ship set sail for Canada, loaded with cargo, hoping for better luck. But upon arriving in Halifax, the owners were hit with another shock: a tonnage-based entry toll. Because the Great Eastern had the largest tonnage of any vessel in the world, the bill came to an eye-watering $1,750. Furious, they refused to pay and turned back for Britain. The 1860 voyage had proved the ship's engineering strength, but it also confirmed the financial reality: the Great Eastern was a floating money pit. After returning, the company tried to initiate repairs but ran into legal trouble again. They had to rehire John Scott Russell, yes, again, because he had sued them, claiming his contract was still valid. The court sided with him. Not only did they have to pay for repairs, but also £12,000 in damages. The ship sailed once more in 1861, this time as a troop transport under contract from the British War Office. She carried over 2,000 soldiers to Canada, ahead of the looming American Civil War. That mission was a success, but it was short-lived. The military ended the contract soon after. And then came the hurricane. Later that year, the ship was battered by a violent storm. It lost its paddle wheels, sails, and rudder and had to be towed into port, severely damaged. One sailor died, and the total cost of repairs soared to £300,000. Despite a few profitable runs, the writing was on the wall. In 1862, the ship struck an uncharted rock near New York, tearing a huge gash in its hull. That was the final straw. In 1864, the ship was put up for auction. But in a twist of financial trickery, it was quietly purchased by a small group of the same directors for just £125,000, allowing them to cut out original shareholders and dissolve the original company. For the fourth time, the ship had bankrupted its owners. But there was still hope, this time in a different industry. The Great Eastern was leased to Cyrus Field, the entrepreneur leading the charge to lay the first transatlantic telegraph cable. In 1866, she succeeded, becoming a critical player in one of the century's greatest communication breakthroughs. She would go on to lay thousands of miles of cable connecting India, the Middle East, and other far corners of the globe. But even this golden age was short-lived. When the Suez Canal opened, the Great Eastern was too large to pass through, making her obsolete for many routes. By the 1880s, the once mighty ship had become a floating billboard, a tourist trap, and occasionally a hazard, damaging at least 10 ships during her strange and unlucky career. Her final promotional voyage in 1886 ended in disaster, and by 1888, the decision was made: the Great Eastern would be scrapped. It took 18 months to dismantle her. Her steel was repurposed. Her wood became furniture, pub counters, and even school stages. Though she failed as a passenger vessel, the Great Eastern left behind a powerful legacy, one of limitless ambition, pioneering engineering, and spectacular financial ruin. Her revolutionary double hull, bulkhead compartments, and hybrid propulsion system were decades ahead of their time and would eventually become industry standards. She was a ship built for a future that wasn't ready for her. In the end, the story of the Great Eastern isn't just about a ship, it's about the cost of vision, the peril of innovation, and the indomitable human spirit that dares to dream bigger than the ocean itself. Oh, and if you're still here, I nearly forgot, there's a ghost story attached to this ship. But that, my friend, is a tale for another video. On my other channel, They Won't Tell You. Links in the description if you're feeling brave enough.